everyone. In this video we are going to talk about the concept of formations. So before we go to the concept where how we form different kinds of formations and how we counter different kinds of formations, the very first thing which I believe we should do is define exactly what is formations. So formation is nothing but the sequence in which our troops engage in the battlefield. For example, if we are sending more than one type of troop in the battlefield, so the factor which determines whether our one type engages first or the second type, now that whole concept is called formations. So as we know that there are four different types of troop types. The very first one is infantry, second is cavalry, third is spearmen, and the fourth one is royal bowmen. So for example, if we are sending infantry and cavalry in the battlefield, whether our infantry engages first or cavalry, now that concept is called formations. We can decide, we can change it as per the requirement, as per our necessity. Alright, so the very first thing which we must look at is the counter mechanism. So as we can see here, bowmen are neutral. That means they are neither countered nor they counter any other troop type. Alright, and that leaves us with just three different troop types now: infantry, cavalry, and spearmen. Infantry are countered by cavalry. Cavalry, on the other hand, are countered by spearmen, and completing the circle, spearmen are countered by infantry. So, to have a basic understanding, if our enemy has cavalry and we send infantry, that means we will be having a disadvantage because the cavalry from our enemy will counter our infantry. But instead, if we are sending spearmen, that means our spearmen will have an edge over cavalry, and that's when we will get the advantage. Now, to have a more clear understanding of the counter mechanism, let's have a look at one of the battle reports. Okay, so this is one of the battle reports which I have from the recent time. Now, if you just go to the bonus tab and scroll down a bit, this is what you can see. The very first line says infantry versus infantry damage, and that is 100%. Infantry versus cavalry damage is 50%. Infantry versus spearmen damage is 200%. Now, as you can see, infantry is neither countering infantry because it's like for like, and it's neither getting countered, so that is 100% damage. But when they go up against cavalry, damage is reduced by 50%. That is just half of it. And at the same time, if they are going up against spearmen, damage is going up. It's just doubling up to 200%. And when they are going up against bowmen, it's basic 100%. Cavalry versus bowman is also 100%. Spearman versus bowman damage is also 100%. Bowman versus bowman damage is also 100% because bowmen are neutral. They are neither countered nor they counter. So this is the counter mechanism which we talk about. Infantry has an edge over spearmen. Spearmen has an edge over cavalry, and cavalry has an edge over infantry. So let's say if we are having infantry and the enemy is having spearmen. Now, battle works from two ways. Number one, we are hitting them, and number two, they are hitting us at the same time. It's simultaneous attacks that are happening. So what happens is our infantry deals twice the damage, that is 2 times advantages to us, and at the same time their damage to our infantry is reduced by 50%. That means in rough approximation we can say that it's 3 to 4 times better, because it's not just boosts your attack, what damage you are doing to the enemy, but it also reduces the damage taken by your army, by your troop type. So this is why counter mechanism is really important. It's really important that we decide our formation based on the information that we have, based on the scout report, or if we are aware about the enemy formations, what troops they have. So based on that, if we decide our formations and considering the counter mechanism, it's quite a great plus. Okay, so just now we saw how counter mechanism works. So now going forward, let's see how this counter mechanism can be changed, how it can be reduced, and how it can be turned into our own favor. So how do we do that? It can be achieved through the concept of weapons, which has been introduced recently into the game. So if you go to the main hands, if you go to the weapon and let's say we check for the spear weapon. Now this is a spear weapon which is gold. You go to the reforge and click on this information icon, go to the random attribute list, and what you can see here is reduced enemy infantry versus allied spearmen damage 6.4%, that is the max value, and reduced enemy bowmen versus allied spearmen damage 6.4%. So basically what happens here is by default, if enemy has infantry and we have spearmen, the counter damage is 200%. That is how we are getting hit by 200%. But here it reduces it by 6.4%. So let's say if we have 5 gold spear weapons with all these at this particular attribute maxed, so that would be 6.4 into 5, that is 32%. So that means enemies infantry attack or damage against our spearmen would be reduced by 32%. So this is another thing, this is another way of reducing the counter, reducing the damage which is dealt by the enemy troop type against our troop type. Similarly, if we check for infantry, the infantry weapon gives same kind of attributes for our infantry troops, and if we check for cavalry, then similar kind of attributes. See, reduced enemy spearmen versus allied cavalry, reduced enemy bowmen versus allied cavalry, and at the same time if we check for a purple weapon, then as you can see here, it does not happen. This counter mechanism or this damage reduction is available only for gold weapons. It's not available, this attribute is not available for purple weapons, as you can see here. Okay, so now since we have the basic understanding of different troop types and the counter mechanism, let's talk about some basic formations. Okay, so on the left hand side are the enemy formations, and on the right hand side of the arrow are the formations which we can use to counter them. In the very first formation, we see the enemy is using inf-cav. So in order to counter inf-cav, we can send full cavalries. How it works is enemy's front line is infantry and our front line would be cavalry. So when the battle begins, our front line will have an edge over the enemy front line, and when the enemy's second line, that is cavalry, will come at our front line, even they will not be able to counter us. So all in all, the idea is to counter the enemy front line, but in such a manner that our front line is not getting countered. Because if you see on the right hand side, the enemy formation is inf spear, but in that scenario we are not going with the cavalry front line, because if against inf spear we decide to go cavalry front, now the problem is we will counter the enemy front line of infantry, but then the enemy back line or the second line, which is spearmen, they will counter our front line and deal more damage. So we want to play safe, like if we are in this scenario going infantry front, which means inf and spear, both the enemy types will not be able to counter our front line. So that means 100% damage to the enemy front line and 200% damage to the second line. After that, our second line is cavalry, which means after our infantry, when cavalry will come into the battlefield, when they will engage, they will counter the enemy front line. So as you can see here, we have countered the enemy front line, but we have also tried to save our front line from being countered. Similarly, again moving to the left hand side, if enemy is using cav spear, then we can simply go full spear. Okay. If enemy is using spear inf, then we can go full inf. Now the trick here is, when enemy is using cav spear, we are going in with full spear. But when enemy is using spear cav, then we are not going full spear, because if on the right hand bottom side, if you see, enemy's formation is spear cav. Now what if we go full spear here? The problem would be that we will not be able to counter the enemy's front line. If we go all spear, yes, we will counter the second line, but how will we counter the enemy front line? Because front line engages first, so that becomes really important that we counter the front line. So in order to do that, we add infantry to the second line. So that is why we are going spear inf. And now here comes a small trick. For example, if someone is having his formation set to infantry cavalry formation, but he decides not to send any cavalry, what happens then? The very basic rule is that cavalry are not present in the lineup. You have sent infantry, you have sent spearmen, and let's say there are bowmen as well. Bowmen are always at the end of the formation. Doesn't matter which formation you choose, if you have infantry, cavalry and spearmen, even one troop of each type, then those three different kinds will stay ahead of bowmen. So bowmen are always at the end. So what happens in this scenario is, if you are sending infantry and spearmen, but the formation is set to inf cav, then the formation as per the record remains inf cav, but technically it changes to inf spear. Okay, so let's do a live demo and see how we can use all the 6 different kinds of formations without actually unlocking them. Okay, so we are on the world map now, and what I'm going to do is, I'm just going to hit this rebel group. Now the very first thing is that we can change the formation from this right hand bottom side. My current formation set is inf spear, but I can change it to inf cav, spear inf, or whichever formation I want. Okay, so in order to test it, let's go cav inf. I have here already set it to cav inf formation. Now the trick what I'm going to do is, I will remove all the infantry and I will add spearmen instead, and then let's hit it. The formation set by me is cav inf, but I removed all the infantry from there and added spearmen. So as we can see here, the formation was cav inf, but it obviously changed into cav spear. Now that is a small trick that we can do. Now as we know that by default, one formation that is open for all of us is inf cav, which is the very first formation. After that, we can unlock spear inf and cav spear quite easily, to be honest, but after that, unlocking the next 3 formations is not always easy. I mean, for the beginners in particular, there are way too many researches to be done. So by the time we reach that point where we have unlocked all the formations, we can use this trick. And just one small point, that if you are going in blind, let's say you do not know what your enemy's formation is, but you have a scout where, let's say for example, your enemy has loads of cavalry, but the other troop types are not that many in count. So I would suggest that since he has more cavalry, going spear frontline would be better, because what basically we want is we want to negate the effect of his maximum troop count. So if let's say he has 10 million troops, but 6 to 7 million are cavalry, so if we are going spear frontline, that means we are negating 6 to 7 million troops with that one simple step. So that's it from the video. I hope it helps you guys. Thanks for watching. Cheers.